Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 155 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Today, I have a real treat for you FCPA compliance practitioners. I have Mara Senn, who is a partner at Arnold & Porter. She's going to walk us through some of the calculus that she puts before clients when they need to make a decision about whether or not to self-disclose. She'll also walk you through how you need to think about the structure of your investigation, when it's appropriate to call outside counsel, what to do in terms of remediation and monitoring thereafter. It's a very interesting episode. She's got a lot of good points. The episode comes in at just under 29 minutes. I hope you enjoy it. If you have any questions, please. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to welcome you to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Today, I think you and I are both in for a treat. We're going to visit with Mara Senn. Mara is a partner at Arnold & Porter, and she has a lot of experience in white-collar crime and FCPA work. And I had some specific questions and scenarios I wanted to throw out to her to get her views on FCPA investigations, the decision or not to disclose, and then moving forward from there. So with that rather long-winded introduction, Mara, thanks a lot for agreeing to come on the podcast.
Tom, thank you so much for having me.
What is the nature of your practice in Arnold Porter, and how did you get to be an FCPA Guru S?
I love that Guru S. I think I'm going to start using that. I have been at Arnold & Porter for 14 years, and probably about 8 or 9 years ago, I'd always done international work, and I'd always done white-collar work, and those two combined into a perfect whole in FCPA. So I've really enjoyed that work. I do all manner of FCPA work, so I do everything from investigations, both internal investigations and government investigations, and I also advise clients on compliance efforts, and also I help do due diligence if they have a merger and acquisition or a JV and they want to know what the anti-corruption risks are vis-a-vis that counterparty in the transaction.
Well, Mara, what I wanted to visit with you about specifically is one of the things I think is important if a incident arises up to the chief compliance officer or general counsel, if that's the structure of the company, about a potential FCPA violation is to get someone like yourself, professional white-collar attorney with FCPA experience involved as soon as possible. Clearly a reason is attorney-client privilege, and I think most people understand that. But one of the things I learned as a trial lawyer is you need to understand who your ultimate audience is. And if you start an FCPA investigation, it may well be the Department of Justice. So I was wondering if you could talk us through how you might advise a client who calls you and says, we've had this pop up, we're not sure what it means. How do we go forward?
Sure, and actually that just happened to me the other day. And usually, not always, but often it's in a crisis situation where they've discovered something that they know is bad, and they don't know how bad that particular problem is, and also they don't know how widespread the problem is. So the first thing I would say is that not every single incident requires outside counsel. Obviously, there are HR issues. There are all kinds of issues that can be handled very efficiently and effectively by in-house counsel. But in a situation where there are indicia that this could be more serious, that would include large amounts of money. That would include a high-level person at the company. So in other words, like a typical compliance blip that may happen, you don't need to call in an outside counsel right away. But if you do have these indicia of larger problems, and particularly if you're a public company because you may be involved in reporting obligations, it is a good idea to call outside counsel. Outside counsel doesn't have to be on the ground, and they don't have to be super involved if it's not a very complicated case. But the advantage are a number of things. Number one, there is more credibility that it's an independent review. So if, let's say, from the government's perspective, they don't typically know the companies, and they are typically suspicious that a company is going to try to do what's right for themselves, and they've had instances, unfortunately, where companies have either destroyed documents or tried to hide things. And obviously, if you are working for the company in whatever capacity, the government is not going to believe as much that it's an independent investigation. So in certain situations, an employee may look the other way, either purposefully or not really realizing what they're seeing, and may take the investigation in the wrong direction. So you want to just inoculate against that kind of problem. Also, there are very complicated issues that come up in cross-border situations. So, for example, there are privacy laws, there are labor laws, there are cultural issues, there are language issues, where when a U.S.-based employee might not have been exposed to that. They may have, but not always. And so it's really helpful to have somebody who's very experienced in those kinds of issues. And then probably from the government's perspective, the most important aspect of setting up an investigation in a way that makes them feel comfortable is ensuring that all data is locked down. And sometimes, those of us who do this sort of investigation, we're used to going in and trying to find out, do you have handheld devices? Where are all of your servers? What are your backup tape situation? And we get into the technical nitty-gritty just because we've done this a lot. And if you don't have somebody who's used to doing that, and also people who are interested in forensically retaining information, you could end up having a situation where either information is lost or there's a possibility or a suspicion that information is lost, and that's when the government's imagination goes wild. And so the thing you want to do is just lock down that information. So if it ever comes to a point where the government says, well, we want to kick the tires, you can say, okay, don't worry, we've got everything you would have gotten otherwise. So those are a number of the situations, I think, where and reasons that you'd want an outside counsel involved.
I've heard other FCPA practitioners talk about the biggest thing you as outside counsel bring is credibility. And the way you've explained it, it really starts from day one, the minute you get that phone call. It's not when you're sitting across from a DOJ representative, making a representation to be truthful. You've got to know it really from the start.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the government will put you to your paces. And if they realize that, or they think that all you're doing is parroting what they consider to be the company line, and you haven't gone in and independently really taken a look for yourself, you're just going to come off as less credible, as somebody that they can't really trust. And that is definitely something that a company wants to avoid at all costs.
Well, Meryl, after that you get that initial call, what steps do you advocate a company take?
Sure. Well, like I said, you don't want to go too crazy because at the beginning you have no idea what the scope is. But you do want to take steps to immediately lock down that data. So that's really the first thing you want to do. And then what I tend to do is when we go in and then you want to figure out who do you send a document hold to. But before you do that, you have to figure out, is there a potential bad actor who, when they realize that an investigation is starting, could go run around and start destroying documents? So sometimes, depending on the situation, you may actually do somewhat of a stealth investigation where instead of going, full bore and sending out document holds and things like that, you first want to essentially get that person's information and make sure that they're not going to do anything to their information, or if there are a number of people are at issue, you want to lock that down as well. And then once you feel comfortable that you've locked that down, you go through and you collect documents forensically. You bring in a vendor. And what I like to do, because at the beginning you don't really know the scope, is as you're collecting documents, and you may decide to collect documents from only a handful of people, is you do what I like to call lay of the land interviews. So you basically go in with no documents because you don't have any yet, and you say, these are the things that we're going to collect from you, but could you just sort of tell us about the situation we're looking into? And you get very quickly you understand sort of who the players are, who may have been involved, and you can do a lot of that legwork beforehand by working with your client, looking at org charts and figuring out kind of the scope of everybody who could touch that transaction, that country, whatever the scope of what you're looking into. But it's really important to scope it in a way that's rational and reasonable and cost sensitive, because you don't want to start collecting from 100 people when really all you're worrying about is one person who embezzled money in Indonesia and may or may not have done something with that money. That's a very different situation than if the head of your international sales department, who is responsible for all your countries around the world, is found to have done something potentially improper. So, you're really trying to scope out as you're gathering information. You're also trying to calibrate to make sure that the scope of your investigation is appropriate.
Well, you touched on HR issues, and one of the questions I'm often asked is when, if at any point in this process, is it appropriate to institute discipline or terminate an employee who may be the bad actor? On the one hand, you may want to get rid of them as soon as possible to show that you're moving forward to remedy. On the other hand, you may need to keep that person around to interview them or as a resource for your investigation going forward. How do you approach that question?
Sure. I mean, that is a very case-by-case difficult question to answer. But in general, I think it's better to keep them around for as long as you may need them, because once they've been fired or otherwise disciplined, really, even if you keep them around, they're going to be less cooperative with you, and possibly if you fire them, not cooperative at all. And you can require them to be cooperative in a termination agreement, but obviously in practice, cooperation can mean a lot of different things. So what you really want to do is you want to take that person out of the responsibilities where they had problems before and maybe either move them to a different responsibility or just take away their access maybe that they had to money or other sorts of things that were the root of the problem, but keep them on until such time as you really think that you're not going to have any need for them, because once they're gone, and you can't get them back. And often, for example, the government might want to interview that person, and if you fired them and that person has moved away or is now inaccessible to the government, it's actually worse. So my tendency is to keep them around, but just prevent them from continuing to do any of the harm that may have previously done.
Kind of the not ultimate, but perhaps penultimate question in a lot of these is the decision to disclose. How do you help a client work through that decision, and what advice or guidance do you give them?
Sure. I mean, I think this is sort of the raging issue of the day, is whether to disclose FCPA violations. And I think many practitioners, private practitioners, are relatively large advocates of self-reporting. I tend to be on the opposite side of the spectrum, even though it's arguably against my self-interest. But I really think that self-reporting should be the exception rather than the rule. And that is really at bottom, as I like to say, because when you invite the government in like a bad party guest, they absolutely never leave. And a lot of the reasons that you may want to self-report to me are reasons that don't hold a lot of water. I mean, I think that the sort of common wisdom, I don't agree with it, and I'll explain why. I mean, first, to look at sort of the structure of self-reporting, the thing that I think gets lost in the shuffle is there's absolutely no legal obligation to self-disclose in FCPA cases at all. So there may be other disclosure obligations because of a public company or what have you, but under the law of the FCPA and under criminal law, no company has an affirmative duty to self-disclose. Despite this, self-disclosure in FCPA cases has really become the norm, or for a while it became the norm. And unlike the first-in principle in cartel cases where the first company who's the first in to self-report gets immunity, it's a totally different structure in the FCPA area for many reasons, not all, most of which are appropriate, but you don't get immunity, you get cooperation credit, supposedly. And that is based on the sentencing guidelines. But the problem is that a lot of these calculations are very, very opaque. So under the sentencing guidelines, you get a 5-point decrease if you self-report, cooperate, and accept responsibility. You get 2 points off if you cooperate and accept responsibility, and then just 1 point for accepting responsibility. So under this system, supposedly self-disclosure standing alone is worth 3 points, and each of the other ones is worth 1. Now, in my experience, you get almost as much credit, if not as much credit, for cooperating with the government once they come to you, even if you didn't disclose in the first place. And so the myth is that self-disclosure is some kind of really big bump in cooperation credit, and I think in practice that really doesn't sort of bear water. So that's one of the reasons I don't think in general that self-disclosure is a type of thing that you need to run to right away.
I have to say that I've really heard no one walk through the sentencing guideline and score analysis in that manner. So that's a great way to think through it, and I really appreciate you sharing that with us. It's certainly something that really every compliance practitioner needs to be cognizant of. So very well done. But there is another facet to self-disclosure, and that is probably something that you've experienced as well, which is credibility with the government. And, I hear many practitioners say, I'm going to have more credibility in negotiating with the government if I self-disclose, as opposed to if the government finds out in any of the myriad other ways it can determine that there is a potential violation. How do you think through that, or how do you help a client walk through that?
Sure. I mean, in the end, for a client, they care about the bottom line. They want to do the right thing. Almost all clients do. But in the end, they want to know, how much will it cost me? And so this idea of credibility by self-disclosing is so, I think, it's intangible and it's not quantifiable. And so, for those of us who regularly appear before the government, we already have credibility, and they understand that the client may or may not agree with recommendations we make, and that they know that we'll be a straight shooter once we're in front of them, however we get in front of them. So this notion that by us coming and telling them about it, we'll get more credibility, I don't think it holds water, because if they come to you, then you can tell them about it and say the exact same thing in the same credible way. Is my personal perspective. A good friend of mine, John Drimmer, who's at Barrett Gold, he told me about a really interesting way of looking at it, and I think, to me, it sort of captures the way that he and I slightly differ on our outcomes, but the structure, I think, is really interesting, which is essentially you've got it's kind of like a SWOT analysis with the 4 different squares, and on one axis you have the seriousness of the potential violation, and then the likelihood of discovery on the other axis. And in both of these areas, both the seriousness and the likelihood of discovery, I sort of draw the line, I think, in a more, to me, more rational, but it may be different than the traditional norm. I think that the likelihood of discovery issue is really, really important if you think that companies get a lot of credit for self-reporting. If you don't think that, which I don't think that they do particularly, then really the focus is on cooperation and not so much on the self-reporting itself. And in general, I think that the likelihood of discovery is very small in all of these cases. And that's for a simple reason, which is in most of these cases, the bribes are hidden. I mean, it takes me a long time to find out the information I do, and that's because I'm speaking to an insider. And that's really what the government needs to make their case. So who are these insiders? I mean, one, they're whistleblowers, which most employees really don't realize they can get money from the government if they are whistleblowers on these sorts of things. I don't think it's been particularly well publicized, and obviously employers are not training their employees to explain to them that they can be whistleblowers. And if you look at the latest SEC whistleblower report, only 4.3% of the tips reported were FCPA cases. So it's not like people are hitting down their door with all these FCPA cases. It's a relatively rare, instance where a whistleblower comes. And then the other people besides whistleblowers who could, at least in theory, provide this information are outside auditors, and they're not allowed to be whistleblowers under Dodd-Frank. So, really it comes down in a lot of ways to whistleblowers, or if you have the level of seriousness that's so broad that it's going to be, discovered anyways. But the likelihood of discovery is pretty low. And then, what is serious? I mean, is the SEC takes the perspective that if you violated books and records, which I'm sure every company for sure has violated books and records in some way or the other, the way the SEC describes it, that you should disclose that. Well, that doesn't make any sense for a company to run to the SEC or DOJ every time they have some piddly little violation. And so I think you just have to be really careful about how you're defining likelihood of disclosure, which I think is very low. And then when you weigh that against the negatives of disclosing, which everybody knows about, which is, you could be investigated by enforcers in multiple countries. You could be investigated for additional potential criminal infractions like sanctions or taxes. It's much more expensive to self-disclose if you assume that you're not getting a lot of substantive credit for disclosure. And then, if you enter into a plea or a DPA or an NPA, you're in it for 1 to 3 more years. Everything that happens to you, you have to run to the government. So, I will say that DOJ right now is doing a fantastic job, and I really think that the people in there are really going to, help themselves in terms of disclosing information about what they do, which is they're going to become more transparent about how they do these calculations. And if I'm wrong, and in fact they do give significant credit for self-disclosure, then my opinion and maybe those of others may change. But as of right now, I see no specific proof that self-disclosure is all that in terms of a good idea for the companies.
Well, certainly on the score, I've heard department representatives talk that they are constrained by the number of points they can give, and you split out the points, even indicating that it's a maximum of 3. So, clearly how much credit can be given, because so many other factors go into it, and the best you can get is a -5 anyway. So.
Well, I mean, the way they do their, even when they're going to be transparent about it, that's only part of the picture, because the way they do their calculations is they may say, oh, well, this isn't really, if they want to be more nicer to a company, or, they think they're being more cooperative, they might say, oh, you know what, this is not really a benefit that they got from the bribes because this is outside the scope. So they can basically redraw the scope of the issue so that the baseline amount of benefit they get, which is what really drives the fees, and then the points are kind of off of that. Mm-hmm. They have a lot of discretion. And not now, in some cases, there's like one big transaction and that's it. But in these larger ones, it's in 10 different countries and there are 50 different transactions, and they can choose to drop or add or slightly change certain transactions that can really have a significant effect on the level of fees. So even then, that's the secret, I think, is they do have discretion on the scope of penalties.
Yeah, it's a really interesting way to think through it, and I really encourage you to maybe write and speak about that, because no one is really articulating the analysis that you're bringing to this. So very, very interesting. Even after you've made the decision not to disclose, that doesn't end the journey, because you now have to move to the remediation stage if you're not going to self-disclose. How do you help a company understand that and walk them through what they need to do if they make the decision not to self-disclose?
Sure. I mean, essentially the best position that a company possibly can be in, and really the only position it should be in if it decides not to self-disclose, and, there are risks, and we talk through those, but really the best way to go about it is to act as if the government is breathing down their necks on this very issue and fully remediate. And the nice thing is they can decide what that means, fully remediate. It used to be that the in the government's view, fully remediating meant go to 10 different countries, even if there's no suspicion of any activity going on, and just to make sure that everything's okay. They're now backing away from that, and in fact, they're saying that the private sector is the one who started that whole trend, which is not quite consistent with history. But in any case, I mean, you want to be squeaky clean so that when the government comes to you, if in the future, like a year down the line, you have another problem or the government has a whistleblower or whatever, that you can say, look, in our opinion, we did an analysis and we thought it was not necessary to self-disclose. On the other hand, we were horrified and very upset by the fact that this potential infraction happened on our watch, and we've done the following 5 things, and we've remediated. And that may mean, bulking up your compliance programs, firing someone, docking somebody's pay, suspending them. There are a million HR things and structural things, because what you want to do is you want to show to the government, we understand the problem that caused this, and we got to the root of it. Either it's a bad apple, and we got rid of that bad apple, or it was really a failure of compliance structures, and we've fixed that part of the compliance structures, and in fact, we've added more just to double check and make sure that in this particular area or, similar areas, depending on what it is, we will detect, prevent, and if we detect something, we will remediate. And so that the government can feel comfortable that you did what they would have asked you to do anyways. And that doesn't have to always be onerous. I mean, sometimes it is, depending on the scope of the issue. But, that's what I would say about that.
And then, of course, as you articulated, if you do disclose and enter into any sort of settlement agreement, short of a declination with the government, you're going to have some sort of relationship going forward for 18 months to 3 years. It may or may not include an external monitor, but even if it doesn't, you're going to have to report to the government some type of intervals. And so I wanted to use that as an introduction. Do you advocate that a company who does not self-disclose but does remediate would monitor that remediation as if the government was looking over their shoulder? So if the government did ever come back, they could show not only did we remediate, we monitored to ascertain that the fix we put in place actually worked.
Absolutely, but I think that monitoring requirement has now essentially expanded to the whole program. The government really expects you now to be having ongoing improvement and ongoing monitoring, so that it's not like you put in a policy 3 years ago and don't do anything and then assume it's okay. So I don't think I think maybe you would put in a special, extra audit or something like that on that particular situation, but really you should have in your compliance program an overall monitoring function that allows you to do that for all of your programs in various levels and various degrees. So yes, I think so, but it may not be as intensive as your typical external monitor, because you're going to be integrating that into a program that's really more holistic than just checking on that one thing. You're going to be checking on a system-wide basis.
Well, Mara, this has been really a fascinating podcast, and I can't thank you enough for contacting me so that I could interview you and really get some of these concepts out. Like I said, no one is really articulating them in a manner that I've heard you do so. Unfortunately, we're near the end of our time, but I wondered if I could ask you if anyone wanted to follow up directly with you on any of the things that we've talked about. Could they shoot you an email, and if so, how would they get in contact with you?
Absolutely, yeah. That would be great if they want to. My email is Mara, M-A-R-A, _Senn, S-E-N-N, @aporter.com, and that's also where you can find the Arnold & Porter website is where you can find my bio. And I'm also always available to chat at 202-942-6448.
Well, Mara, thank you very much, and I look forward to continuing the dialogue.
Thank you so much for having me, Tom. I appreciate it.
All right.